there, my name is Sandra Phillips and I'm with MoveMe, and I'm the host for this month's Multimodal Monday. Today is the Data Privacy Day, which is why we're focusing on data, privacy, and shared mobility. And I'm very excited that Marla Westervelt from the Coalition of Reimagined Mobility is joining us. So welcome, Marla.
Thank you.
Maybe before we get into kind of the details of data and shared mobility and privacy, maybe just tell us a little bit about the coalition. It's a new thing, I think, founded in 2021.
Yeah.
So give us kind of what it is all about and why.
Absolutely. So I'll start giving a quick introduction of myself. So I'm Marla Westervelt. I am the head of policy here at the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility. I spent the last decade or so working in transportation policy, started my career in Washington, D.C., where I spent a lot of time at think tank land, working on federal level transportation policy, financing and funding. From there, I went to LA Metro and was one of the founding members of the Office of Extraordinary Innovation, where I got to do a lot of the on-the-ground implementation of the ideas we were incubating in Washington. From there, I spent some time at Bird, the scooter company, where I worked a lot on data sharing, both with cities as well as with the data processors or the intermediaries that would process and help cities understand what those data meant. Spent a little bit of time working at an organization that manages data specifications to power Apple Maps and Google Maps, and now I'm here. I feel like that background is really, really relevant for what we're doing at the Coalition. So the Coalition is a group of former policymakers and CEOs from around the world that are interested in developing policy solutions that better prioritize people and the planet. So over the last 50, 70 years, we've built our cities and we built our transportation systems around technology. We see that every day when we look out our windows because it's built around the automobile. And so it was really exciting for me, and why I took this role is we have CEOs from companies such as Ford saying, we don't want to do that anymore. We don't want the world to be built around the automobile. What does that mean from a policy perspective? And how then do we as businesses work to adapt to be able to provide people the ability to get where they want to go, when they need to go, and get the goods that they need without necessarily focusing on this one technology solution, which of course has had suite of negative implications over the past 50 years or so.
That's awesome. Like we work in shared mobility, which is all about really the end user, and you got to figure out how that works. But at the same time, I feel like even shared mobility struggles with this whole technology driven mindset. And now how do you shift the narrative around that on all levels? I think that's really exciting and very much needed. So since we just started 2022, what do you think is, and this is all about multimodal travels, right? Not choosing one mode over another, but how do we build ecosystems really where people can move around? What do you think 2020 has in store for multimodal travel, and specifically also from the data perspective?
Yeah, I think that that's a really great question. So, we look back at the last couple of years of the pandemic, and, from a data perspective, we got all really excited of saying, oh, let's make sure that we have occupancy counts on our cars and are able to share those data through GTFS and make an extension and all of this customer facing data accessibility. I think that stuff is great and that stuff is really sexy. But to me, what I hope 2022 has in hold of it is the back end, right? And this is both for the movement of people and goods. So when we think about the movement of people, it's figuring out how do we make sure all of our systems can be interoperable, which leads to a better customer experience. So this kind of builds on a lot of the work that organizations like CalITP or Mobility Data are already doing to say, we aren't able to have these connections, and a transit agency today has to buy a whole suite from one vendor, and it's really hard to plug anything else to. What's more is you also can't plug in any other options like a shared mobility option. And if we really want to have that positive customer experience, you need to solve the back end issue. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting, the same is true in the movement of goods. So as we know, we're in the midst of a supply chain crisis. And that crisis is not going away as quickly as folks would like. And, you know, right now is a single moment of time with climate change. We're going to have to anticipate squeezes on our supply chain at a more frequent rate, and that we are going to have to build in more resiliency. So to me, what does that mean? It means figuring out how to communicate better amongst all of the fragmented stakeholders within the full supply chain. So that means open data standards. You look to something like passenger transportation. We've been talking about open data standards for a much longer time. We have a lot more public sector operators that are more comfortable with sharing those data and have interests that I think are more obviously aligned. So now we're trying to have that conversation on the good side. And while the interests are aligned, when you have to bring together a suite of private sector companies to the table and talk about sharing data that they're not sharing today, that's inherently going to be a challenge. But I have pretty high optimism, particularly in the United States, where US DOT is making this a top priority, that we're going to be able to have movement on these conversations, and even some pilot demonstrations that are starting to develop some of those V0 specifications that hopefully will be the foundational building blocks to building those standards.
Right. And I'm kind of going to jump to my next question. I know I want to talk about privacy, but I think it ties well into, you already alluded to this challenge of like integration and interoperability and having one standard. I was going to talk about Tom P, but I'm actually going to talk about an initiative by the car sharing, Bundesverband for car sharing in Germany, because it's the same thing, right? They have three major players on the station-based car sharing side, so the Zipcar model, and they all have data, and they literally all collect kind of the same, but nothing is the same when you then try and integrate. So what they did is they built that mid layer that now any mass platform can tap into. Instead of integrating into the three players, now they have that mass layer. And so what I'm hearing you say is like, this is needed, but it's also needed on the good side. And you have high hopes. I always feel like Europe is a little bit further ahead when it comes to that, in the sense that I think the European Union just funds some of these standardization, because they had to standardize literally everything from the plug in the wall to the soother that is sold in every store in Europe. So what do we need to do in North America? Like the US is one thing, I sit in Canada. What do we need to do to get to that as well?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I would also say, Europe does a really good job in developing standards, but doesn't necessarily always do a job at developing standards that are minimum viable products, very implementable, and drive private sector adoption, particularly when they don't have to. And I bring that up because, this is an issue that we're having when it comes to GTFS. GTFS is not the European standard, but European public transit operators are producing GTFS because it's a lot easier to produce than the European standard. So to me, it is, we need to be focusing on global level standards on whatever the problem is. And we need to be focusing on what is the most lightweight thing I can do. So it's not having a standard necessarily that has all the bells and whistles. It's what's the key problem we need to solve today. Let's start with that, because that's something that is going to be a lower cost for every business to be able to produce. And then likely you're going to be able to grow on that. I think, when you're talking about mobility as a service versus movement of goods and all those things, is there are very, very different stakeholders at the table and very different reasons they do or they don't want to comply, right? So in the movement of goods right now, we're living in an analog world, right? So let's say, for example, you have a ship that is leaving a port in Asia. They're going to send a fax over to the port of Los Angeles. And the port of Los Angeles, someone might pick up that piece of paper and read it, but they're not going to then reply and tell them that they know that and are preparing for them. So then they're going to arrive to the port and they're going to say, okay, we're here. And they're going to say, okay, great. you can wait in line for the next few weeks, or, however long it's going to be. So like that is a pretty obvious challenge that we have the technology in the 21st century to solve for. And business interests are aligned pretty easily. And yes, there's going to be a heavy lift in terms of like developing out that standard and producing it. But for some things like that, it's just such low hanging fruit. I think when we're talking about mobility as a service, I think it's a different conversation, because I think that there is a business conversation to be had about, okay, if we ask these car sharing operators or whomever else to start producing data against these standards, who can consume those data? And then how do each of those entities get paid? I think that we often are having this conversation saying, okay, I will charge the operator X percentage fee for every trip that I book. Well, let's remember, passenger transportation is a very, very low to negative margin business. So that doesn't really work either. And so when I think of all the technical problems of mobility as a service, none of them are technical. It's that the business interests aren't aligned, and the businesses are going to make it technically infeasible until it is in their business interest.
Right. And now we talk, and I fully agree, like mobility as a service in a lot of ways is all about business and partnerships, and how do you actually align people there. Now, the one thing we originally started out with, like, we built around technology, how do we move building around users? Now we talked about technology and business, and where's the user fit in? As I said, today is like data privacy day. So how does the user fit into all of this? We're collecting all these data points on the personal side, and I'm actually thinking even on the logistics side, at some point, my data points are going to get collected. So how do we, like, in a way protect it, but also it's ultimately my data. I may not want. It's a hot potato, this topic, and how to handle it. What are your thoughts on that?
This is a great question too. So I work for a global organization. And one of the things that I've learned is across the world, people have very different relationships to their data. So I can't really make any blatant statements around that. What I can say is we are collecting way more data than is necessary for pretty much any use case. I think that we have opportunities, particularly more mature businesses, to start to identify what those use cases are much more clearly, start to define more clear retention policies, and then get rid of the rest of the data. There is data that is going to help us, either being us as operators operate better, or us as cities be able to manage our cities better. That does not necessitate lots of granular data about individual movements. That necessitates an aggregation of a lot of different movements to understand trends. When we're talking about, using data to measure compliance, that does necessitate a little bit more granularity, but not to the granularity that I think a lot of the conversations, particularly the conversations around MDS, have had. I think when I reflect over the last 4 or 5 years on MDS and other data conversations, is we're using data as a power conversation rather than as a conversation about how do we collect the data and utilize data in a way that meets people's needs. And I think in order for us to move to that part of the conversation, we really need to figure out how to resolve the trust issue that is really underlying a lot of our issues.
And I think it's interesting you said, I can't speak globally because we all have different cultures have different hesitancy around sharing. I also think different demographic segments have different hesitancy. A senior transportation working group, the first thing, as soon as the word data is mentioned, is like, how is my privacy protected? Which doesn't happen if you deal with millennials generally. But that's actually not where I wanted to go. I'm currently reading Invisible Women, which is a fantastic book. I'm going to advertise it again. Like, if you haven't read it, read it. But the reason I find it so interesting is because when we collect data, as you said, we collect oodles of data. And then at the same time, we have this blind spot on certain things where we don't have enough data. And I think specifically going back to the earlier comment around how do we design systems for the users? And a user is not one type of demographic, which is young, well-educated, high income, generally male, but there's a lot of other people in our society. So how do we also ensure that? Like, yeah, it's one of the things where at Movie really also trying to understand, because it's quite frustrating that we keep designing systems for kind of same groups of people that are already well served. So how do we serve for the others? Like, any thoughts? I know this is kind of coming from the left field now, but
No, I love this question. So when I worked at Bird, I had to navigate all sorts of data requests. And so many cities said, can I have the demographic data of the writers? First of all, if we had that demographic data of the writers, I would have said no, because that is personal data and we can't share that. But the fact of the matter is we didn't have that data. We could use data science to try to, pinpoint who the people might be, but that's not data we were collecting. And the best way to collect those data and collect a lot of detailed data on people and different types of people is using the old school planning tools of surveys. Yes, we have better ways to conduct surveys today with access to the internet and access to cell phones, and people can opt into programs. But ultimately, what we need to be doing is going to the communities, gathering their data from them, having them share that with us, both in terms of how they're moving around, what their barriers are, where they want to go, and what their trips look like. In addition to looking at kind of the more real movement data that we have. Because I think also, to your point, or one of the things I think you're alluding to, is we don't have a lot of great data on all of the trips that, for example, a woman might take during the day to take care of her family, or go to the grocery store, or whomever is the primary caregiver in any family. And particularly as we look at this pandemic world and start to contemplate whether the office is ever going to look the same, where, going into our third year of the pandemic, I think my optimism on that is decreasing. But we have to be collecting data in different ways, and it needs to be through these human methods, in my opinion.
Yeah, so there's something to be said about community engagement, making sure that they're at the table and be part of it, and not just assuming that we can build some sort of digital version of our society to figure that out, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, to that end, you're bringing up the concept of like digital twins and other types of synthetic data that a variety of different companies are developing. I think your company might even be developing that as well. I think that there is value in those synthetic data, but it's going to miss something, because synthetic data is still built by humans with human biases built into it. And, at the end of the day, a lot of those people coding those systems are probably affluent white men. And they're merely human, and they're not going to be able to capture all the movements and realities of the types of lives people are living that are just outside of the scope of their interaction.
Yeah, totally. And it's the same for us, right? It's like, as I said, we have this little mini planning tool that it's just my team that uses it when we work with clients internally. And we're struggling with the same thing. The coder, as Juan said, granted, we're a very mixed team and diverse team, so there's different requests for him, but it's the same thing. We're struggling with the same. And then, like, I think Invisible Women also highlights that we often just have data gaps, because we keep collecting the same type from the same population that's already in it, and we don't think outside of the box of how to get the others.
I think that, something that's worth highlighting when you're having this type of conversation is, at least in the American context, right? We spend so much time gathering data, trying to understand the data. Data is just one of the many inputs that we use to make any decisions. And so I think, leveraging digital twin tools, or leveraging all these different data resources, just because that they're imperfect doesn't mean we shouldn't do that. But that's already, not how we make decisions. We also consider, what are the financial implications? What are the political implications? What can I do in my tenure? All of these things are inputs. And I think what is important for us as professionals is understanding the limitations of each of the inputs so that we're able to make the best decision based on whatever suite of information that we have.
And that's actually a perfect segue to kind of my almost last question. And that's like, so what do governments need? Like part of the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility is help governments and empower them to make better decisions. So what do they need?
Yeah, I think governments need one of the things we've been talking about a lot, I think, over the last 5 years, which is staff with higher data literacy. Those jobs can be very challenging to hire for, particularly in the context of what we're able to pay in the scope of government. You can go work for government and make, let's say, $70,000 doing one thing, and you can make $200,000 plus doing a similar thing at another place. That's a really challenging HR question that I think that we need to grapple with. I think we also need to get better at figuring out how to procure technology products. So it's not just making sure we can have some expertise in-house, but that we're able to have contracts that speak to the types of services and products we are trying to buy. I'll give a quick anecdote on that. I negotiated a contract from LA Metro, and being able to find a lawyer with any intellectual property experience was very, very challenging. And ultimately, we kind of found one that we were able to use for 30 minutes and had to kind of go off what we could find on the internet. And so like there aren't all of these layers of expertise to help the public sector be positioned well, I think, in interacting with a suite of technology products or being able to ingest and understand data. I think another thing governments are going to need is clearer understanding of what policies are necessary to protect the constituents. So like going back to that privacy issue, like how do we best protect them, and at what levels of government should we be protecting them, and what does that mean for how we store, retain, or don't retain data in-house, and how do we communicate about that clearly? I think that those are probably two of the largest things that I think are important. And then I think the final thing, and this one is probably the hardest, is having the space and ability to test new things, which can be extremely challenging. We all have constrained budgets. Very, very few, especially transportation agencies, have the financial flexibility to try something and fail. But there needs to be some amount of that possibility, because these industries are at the intersection of the public and private sector. Nothing that the public sector is delivering in transportation is done fully alone. So in that reality, how then can we test out those relationships and create better relationships in a way that isn't going to result in someone getting fired on the front page of the local newspaper?
Right. Oh, that's such a challenging one, because it's at the intersection of politics and right. You do the right thing, it's great. You do one little thing wrong and you will be on that front page. Oh, it's such a challenging one. So I think to kind of quickly summarize a few of the pieces that we discussed. So I think one of the things you said is like data standards really have to think about MVP, essentially. I'm using a technology term now, but really like what's the lowest common denominator that we really need to gather? And that's important for the standardization, but also on the privacy side. If we can figure that out, that's really helpful. I think on the government side, really, you're saying they need, it's a new skill set. It's a new world, like the whole digitization. Data is one piece, right? It's like, and that world moves fast. It moves at agile 3-week cycles, not at like 8-year planning cycles.
Right.
So we need that. And then I think to be maybe a little bit provocative, we gotta maybe be a little bit less infatuated with the thought that hard data is the one and only solution to solve our transportation problems, that we have to add other pieces of data. So that would be my kind of summary. anything that I maybe missed and you want to highlight again?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And I think I just want to double down on that last point is, data is not a panacea. It's a really exciting thing that we're producing more of it. And we should be harnessing ways in which to understand and process and use that data for the public benefit. But just like anything else, it's an input amongst a large suite of input, and it's an imperfect input because also, by the way, even data collected through all the IoT devices in the world, that data typically doesn't make any sense. You have to use a lot of assumptions to start to figure out what it actually means. If we're able to set up systems that allow us to look at the data for what it is, as that input, as just being as imperfect as any other input, I think that we can use it to help improve our cities, and hopefully be able to better serve people by putting people on the planet first and helping people get where they need to go when they need to get there and get the goods that they need, ideally on time.
All right, that sounds like almost a perfect closing statement, and give you like one chance to kind of say what's next for the Coalition of Reimagined Mobility. So what's this year?
Absolutely. So year one for us was really a building year. Year two is we are getting our hands dirty. So we'll be releasing our first paper this fall, which will be on open data standards for digital freight. So how and why are we developing open data standards, and what is it going to do to help reduce emissions and improve operations through the full freight value chain? We'll be diving into our advocacy strategy there, which is both working to get on the ground and develop those standards and have folks start producing data against those standards, in addition to working with national and state or other high level governments to say, what are the frameworks that we can politically push through to push forward this conversation. In addition to that, we're going to be releasing a paper this fall that's looking into the market regulatory structure of passenger transportation and kind of trying to unpack the economic challenges that we presently have. Ultimately, passenger transportation is not economically sustainable without government dollars, especially if you want that transportation to be affordable, equitable, and accessible. So we're going to give a suite of, here are the ways in which you can shape the market to help make it affordable, equitable, and accessible, and here are the trade-offs you're going to make. And that necessarily is going to mean, how do we interact with the private sector in a positive way? And if we choose not to, what is the large trade-off? Along with that is going to be a suite of advocacy across 3 continents as well, to seek to start to catalyze pilots and start to change the conversation so that we can better set ourselves up for a future where we're able to meet our 2050 climate goals.